Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
I personally can't think of anything better to do than to find a good book, a comfortable space, and read.
Hello and welcome to Sundoku, the podcast where one book is never enough. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Kath Keneally.
So Kath, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, we're going to be talking to Danielle Clode, who is somebody I know as a very, very good non-fiction writer. And I came across a book of hers a year or so ago that made it into the shortlist for the Non-Fiction Awards for Writers' Week in Adelaide this year.
Because you're actually a judge of this, aren't you?
I am. It's one of the things I do. And every 2 years I get boxes and boxes and boxes of unrelated books that we then have to judge. It's a fraught business, but it's fascinating. And I loved this particular book. It's called In Search of the Woman Who Sailed the World. And Danielle has found all there is to find in terms of written records about Jeanne Barret, who was a French woman who dressed herself up as a man, got on board a ship that was going off on a French ship that was going off on a scientific voyage around the world with her patron, possibly also her lover, but in any case, she appeared to be his assistant on board, his scientific assistant. She did a lot of the work when they stopped to find scientific discoveries all around the world, around about the same time as Darwin was doing the same thing. And she made it. She was eventually unmasked, but she was allowed to stay on board, and she ended up in Mauritius and I think finally back in France. But Danielle will tell us all about it. She intercut that story with her own story of being a child in Port Lincoln when her parents were building a steel-hulled boat, which they then all went off in adventures on around the coast of Australia. So it's quite a fascinating memoir as well.
Absolutely. It sounds like a book for anyone who's a bit adventurous or wishes they were a little bit adventurous.
Wishes, in my case. But yes, it absolutely is.
That sounds fantastic, Kath. Well, I'm going to introduce us a little later to not a book so much as a concept, which is bibliotherapy. Have you ever heard of bibliotherapy?
I think that's what I do every day, isn't it?
It is exactly what you do every day. It's very natural to think that we're all indulging in a bit of bibliotherapy when we read a book, because they do. They carry us away from our cares and our woes, but they can actually bibliotherapy actually does also have a medicinal aspect to it.
There's a condition commonly known as cancer fog, and it affects a variety of things to do with the frontal lobe. So executive functions, concentration, reading to yourself, navigating. It's very upsetting for people experiencing it.
This lady is doing some PhD research. She's looking at the healing effect of being read to whilst you're undergoing chemotherapy. So it's quite specific, but she has a lot to say that has relevance to all of us who enjoy reading.
Absolutely brilliant. It's exactly what I would choose to have, I imagine, in that situation.
Yeah, having someone read to you would be very healing. So we'll learn some more about that. So let's get started with Danielle Clode's book.
All right, so here is Danielle talking about the passions behind the journey that is this book.
I often think about ropes when I'm writing, the threading of multiple narrative strands through a single work with differing perspectives. How to spin such epic tales that stretch across voyages and lifespans, fraught with the challenges of maintaining a continuous unbroken ply of fibres without loose ends or frayed threads. I hate frayed ends. I have always derived great satisfaction from sealing the ends of nylon ropes over the stove and pressing the wax-like lump of plastic into a rag until it cools as a smooth, neat lump. Hemp ropes had to be traditionally whipped with tarred flax and twine wound neatly around and around for several inches before being sealed off and securely fastened. Such binding was unbreakable. The fishermen in Port Lincoln often laughed about caliph's rigging held together with bits of string. Their sneers seemed justified one day when, lifting a heavy load on board, a shackle in the rigging snapped. but the rope whipping was unbroken. It was the welded metal bracket that had snapped under the strain.
And there we have a couple of the strands in the book mentioned. So we're in search of a woman, Jeanne Barret, who did in fact pass herself off as a man, we know this, and sailed around the world on a French voyage of exploration, round about the time Cook was out there doing the same sort of thing, and a lot of other Frenchmen too. But you weave into the story your own childhood growing up on boats and your parents' story as the two people who built one by hand.
Yes, I guess that's one of the things that always struck me in researching the stories of these French voyages around the Pacific, was that, it's a difficult world to describe, I think. Not that many people have spent a lot of time at sea, and so it kind of explains my interest in the subject in the first place, but also I hope to bring a personal angle to what that life is like, even though my experience of living on a boat is very different from Jeanne's experience of living on an old sailing ship. I guess my interest in French exploration in Australia was originated from growing up in Port Lincoln, where there's a map of South Australia's coastline with all French place names, and having French ancestry through my mother's side, I've always found that a really fascinating idea, that perhaps we could have been French instead of English.
That is a great deal of the charm of the book. It's a very delightful insight into a really unusual childhood that you had. I was just rereading the section where you're talking about your mother sewing the sails in the school hall of the high school where she taught on an old Singer sewing machine, miles and miles of heavy canvas by hand.
Yeah, it was a big task. The boat that my parents built was a gaff rig boat, so although it was steel, the rig was traditional, and we had a lot of contact with people in the traditional boat field, I suppose. Whenever you sailed somewhere, if there was another traditional rigged boat in the area, they'd zoom straight over to find out what you were up to and who you were and where you were built and all those sorts of things.
You took yourself off to France in the course of research and found a ship, or a replica of a ship that was very close perhaps to the one that Jeanne Barret would have been on.
There are no ships of that period that are still sailing because they just don't last they didn't last that long. But there are replicas, and that gives us a really good idea of what they felt like and how big they were. They're always interesting because they're quite empty, the replicas, whereas of course they would have been jam-packed, in the day.
So Jeanne Barret herself, she left no written records. You've had to piece this together from journal entries, and particularly from the records of her master. Well, you can tell us how much he mentioned her and how much he left her out of his accounts, and you've had to do a little bit of detective work there. The whole point of her endeavour was to go pass unnoticed. Rumours started to circulate, but as you say, no one actually mentioned in their onboard journals that they'd uncovered her disguise. It was only when word got out later that they kind of revised their accounts to say, I suspected all along.
That's right. It's hard to know how much was known and how much was guessed at the time. Philibert Commerson, the botanist that Jeanne worked for, he wrote a great deal about a great many things, but he doesn't mention her very much at all, very, very rarely. And that's intentional. I mean, it's quite clear that he's disguising his relationship with her because she shouldn't have been on board, and he's trying to avoid a scandal. And he's quite clearly concerned about his family finding out about this relationship, and particularly the fact that there's probably children involved. So it's hidden for that reason. I don't think it's because he doesn't want to acknowledge her achievements, because when he does mention her, he names a plant after her. So this one doesn't tend to get mentioned very much because it's in his Latin notebooks. But it's a very glowing commendation of her achievements and the fact that he couldn't have achieved as much as he did without her support. So, yeah, I think he certainly recognised her worth. And he does also make sure she's mentioned in his will. So he leaves her cared for in his will, which is another factor indicating how important she was to him. But apart from that, they both avoid mentioning any association. And Jeanne herself, when Bougainville finds out, the commander of the voyage, finds out that she's actually a woman and confronts her about this, she claims to have tricked Commerson into taking her on board. She says, no, I've always pretended to be a man, which we now know is not true, because we know that she was his housekeeper in Paris, and she probably had a child to him as well. So they definitely knew each other.
You put a wonderful little snippet in before you start the account of the voyage, and it's from a letter of Commerson to his brother. And he just says, "Don't believe any of the rumours you might hear about me when we get underway."
Yes, he's very worried about that, and yes, his brother-in-law is looking after his child, so from his marriage, so he's quite concerned to stay in the good books.
What was the voyage? What were they doing? It was a scientific exploration.
It's an interesting voyage, because I think the initial motivation for the voyage was because Bougainville, who was a war hero from the Canadian Wars, had taken a whole group of settlers from Canada and settled them on the Falkland Islands with the idea of setting up a French settlement, which sounds like a great idea, except that the Spanish weren't very happy with this idea and complained to the French monarch, who decided that this was a diplomatic difficulty and it was best handed back to the Spanish. So Bougainville was told to go and hand the islands back, and it seems to be almost like it was a bit of a payoff, that he could, once he'd done that, he could continue on with this voyage around the world. And they were keen to have a first French circumnavigation. So it's a matter of French pride, I guess. But it was also the first voyage that employed a scientist on board. So it was the beginning of the great scientific voyages of discovery. And Philibert Commerson was the king's naturalist. And he was extremely well paid on the voyage. So it was a very prestigious appointment.
So it's a bit like Banks, but you also mentioned Darwin, and you say he didn't have a servant. He didn't have a kind of crony helping him. And Jeanne actually seems to have done a lot of the donkey work, actually out collecting specimens.
Well, that was the difference. I mean, Banks and Darwin had servants, but they had to pay for them themselves. So they had to fund themselves. That's the difference. Whereas the French Commerson's servant was paid for by the king, so that's how he employed Jeanne on the voyage. So it was a much more official process, and that actually meant there's a lot of voyages, which I've written about in an earlier book, and on all of them they have a significant scientific staff, and the material goes back to the Paris Natural History Museum and goes into the scientific literature and the scientific research much more systematically than the English research does. Banks never published much of his collections. Flinders and Brown, that work was a little bit erratic as well. So there are publications that come out, and a lot of the collections get misplaced. Whereas the French, it all comes back to, they're very good at centralising archives and material, so the material all comes back to the one place and it's still available.
So what would Jeanne's duties have been? How long did the trip take and where did they go?
They went to South America first, so they travelled across to South America, did all the stuff with the Falklands, went down around Cape Horn, and then into the Pacific from there, and then sailed across the Pacific until they got to Tahiti. From Tahiti was quite a notable stopping point, because both Bougainville and Commerson wrote about the travels. In fact, Commerson sent back his material about Tahiti before he even returned to France, and that was published, and it really captured the French imagination. So that's where we get a lot of our ideas about South Pacific paradise. And, because they were obviously very taken with the Tahitians in general. And then they came across and ran into the Great Barrier Reef on the east coast of Australia. And Bougainville there had the choice between navigating through the reef to get to shore, or heading north towards Java. And he decided that he was running a bit low on food, and so he decided to head north to Java. And also he didn't think that Australia would be worth looking at because it had already been described as a series of shallow, seas and flat islands and barren from the descriptions of the west coast. So he assumed it was the same on the east coast. So he missed that opportunity. But he pretty much came up against Australia at much the same point. Cook would later leave Australia at Cooktown, which I always think is a remarkable thing. So then they travelled home via Java, back to Mauritius in the Indian Ocean, and eventually back to France after that.
Did she have to take her chances with the rest of the crew in the usual rough and tumble and the duties of every day?
Well, that's the interesting thing. She's often depicted as a sailor having to rough it in with all the sailors, but she wasn't a sailor. She was a servant. So she was in quite a privileged position, actually. Basically, she was in with the other officers. Servants typically lived and slept with their masters. Ships don't have a lot of space in them, so the captain would have had a big cabin, but the officers often shared much smaller spaces. At some point, though, Commerson was given the captain's cabin on the ship that he was on. This wasn't Bougainville's ship, it was the second ship on the voyage, the store ship. So he had quite a big cabin, and that was probably because the officers didn't want to share space with his collections, I'd say, because biological collections are smelly and unpleasant. They obviously complained about it. But that also probably gave her access to a toilet, so she wouldn't have had to have shared the heads where all the sailors were. So that would have made things a lot easier for her.
Well, what happened with Jeanne? Did she pull it off for the whole voyage?
That's a very contentious issue in the historical record. Bougainville says that in Tahiti, the Tahitians recognised her immediately as a woman. And the interesting thing is that the Tahitians were looking for the women on the ships for multiple reasons. I think generally when Europeans arrived in other places that hadn't seen many Europeans before, the local people were always a bit puzzled about where all the women were. It's a bit of a worry when a crew of men turn up at your door. That usually means a war party. Whereas if you've got women there, it's less likely to be a war party. So obviously that's a contentious issue. So they were looking for women for that reason. But Tahiti also had a very sexualised society. So public sexual activity was quite common, and that was what the Frenchmen found particularly attractive about the islands. But obviously the Tahitian men were also looking for the same thing with French women. So it's perhaps not surprising that they did notice. Sometime later, when they were in the Solomon Islands, Jeanne was allegedly also accosted by the servants on board who wanted to find out the truth of this proposition, because probably Jeanne was still denying it. And so they uncovered the truth for themselves. So it's not really clear what that encounter was. Some people have suggested it was a rape. I think that's fairly unlikely because Bougainville had given the order that she was not to be upset or harmed in any way, and if there had been a rape, that would have been a very serious crime on a French ship. It's punishable by death. So I can't see how Bougainville could possibly have maintained its authority on the ship without taking action on that.
She continued. What happened to her? And is she, do you think finally she's a kind of feminist icon?
I don't know that she would think of herself as a feminist icon, but she's certainly an amazing role model, I think, just for a woman who lived her own life on her own terms. She and Commerson both left the ship in Mauritius because Commerson wished to continue doing more work in Mauritius. And for a long time it was thought that Jeanne followed him around being his loyal servant, sat next to his bedside as he died and wiped his brow and was ever the loyal servant. And that doesn't entirely seem likely. The story also then continued that eventually she was left poverty-stricken in Mauritius to fend for herself, had to get work as a barmaid, and eventually managed to marry a French soldier who could take her home to France, rescued by by a French soldier. That narrative's completely wrong, because we now know that she got a property, she acquired land, she had servants and slaves, like most people in Mauritius. She ran a tavern and amassed a large fortune of her own. And when she did marry her French soldier, she made him sign a prenuptial agreement to make sure she retained control of her assets. So she returned to France a wealthy woman in her own right. And I think that's a remarkable transformation, that this woman who was born a peasant to the lowest class of French society, a class that wasn't even entitled to own anything, everything they owned passed to their lord once they died, returned to France and became the lord because she owned the manor, she owned the farm.
How did her reputation fare in France? How is she thought of now?
Oh, I think she's widely held up as a model of a French revolutionary woman in a way. The interesting thing about the French explorers is that many of them are quite forgotten in France, and many of them aren't that well known. And I think Jeanne is actually better known than most. Her gravestone is one of the few that is known and recognised and still tended today. Mm-hmm. There's signs up about her wherever she lived. Mm. Yeah, so I think she's well recognised and she's been on stamps and French postage stamps and those sorts of things, which I think she'd be quite surprised by. But even in her own lifetime, though, she was recognised. So she was granted a pension for service, a naval pension for services to the state, despite the fact that she was illegally on board the ship. So she was recognised for her work.
And there have been other biographies of her. And I think part of what you're doing is setting out to correct a few misconceptions. It's
very tempting to fall into cliches and stereotypes when you're talking about women's lives, because we have so few models of women who live different sorts of lives. We don't talk about them very much. It's hard to know the language to use or the narrative to construct about them. And I think that's the thing with Jeanne is she doesn't follow a regular path. She's not a wife, a mother, particularly a servant or a she doesn't have a stereotype to follow. She's an individual, and we don't have trouble with men who are individuals. We're quite comfortable with that. And we need to be more comfortable with women who are individuals as well. And so, other books about her have tended to follow a very cliched, conventional line about women getting in trouble when they have adventures. And they don't always have to get in trouble when they have adventures. Sometimes they can end up with a good ending.
Danielle Clode is the author of In Search of the Woman Who Sailed the World. It's from Pan Macmillan. And Danielle recently recorded a dramatisation of that story for the ABC. We'll put a link to that on our website. So we all know that books can carry us away from everyday cares and worries and take us to another place. But you've been speaking, Michaela, to someone who has a scientific interest in the healing power of books.
Yeah, I am. I want to introduce you to PhD candidate Elizabeth Wells and the fascinating research she's doing into the healing power of being read to when you're undergoing chemotherapy. She's seeing really positive results. But I must say that bibliotherapy isn't just for people who are physically unwell. It has an application for all of us. I'll let Elizabeth explain.
Okay, in a nutshell, it is reading for therapy. It's looking for therapeutic benefits of reading. So there's a few different forms it takes. One is, for instance, self-help non-fiction books. And Wales, for instance, has a national policy of books on prescription. So you might go to your GP with some mild to moderate anxiety or depression. They write a prescription that you take to your library, and the librarian will select from this little set of books that psychologists have pre-approved, and that's your prescription. It's amazing.
How long have they been doing this for?
Some years. The UK is ahead of us.
Why aren't we doing this?
Great question. I don't know. The UK, they have the Reading Agency, they have the Reader. They're both not-for-profit groups that are promoting bibliotherapy and getting great results. Australia, it's little known. Even working as a librarian for years, I was only at a professional development day I came across, bibliotherapy, that sounds amazing.
I did a little bit of reading on bibliotherapy online, as you'd imagine,
Yes.
and I did see a quote that an ancient Greek library in Thebes had inscribed in the stone above the entrance, "Healing place for the soul."
Correct.
So it
Yes.
sounds as if people have known in their gut for a long time that books are very healing, but taking that holistic approach to medicine, it sounds like people in Europe are doing it, but we're not yet doing it here.
Correct. That's true. The other main stream of bibliotherapy that I'll mention, because it's the most relevant to my study, is using fiction. And that's mostly through identifying with a character, and then you get catharsis and healing from it, only because it is relevant to a range of mental health conditions. For my program, it's a little bit different. It's more to do with solace and distraction, which you would expect from if you're going through chronic pain or through COVID as well. Studies found that people were reading for distraction and solace during COVID to help them get through.
So what is your area of study? What is the title of the thesis that you're working on?
Okay, the big title is an exploration of the potential benefits of read aloud programs to the well-being of cancer patients undergoing treatment.
So reading aloud to cancer patients for therapeutic reasons.
Correct. And it's reading aloud because from the time of tumour growth, and it's made worse by treatment, chemotherapy is the worst, but all treatments have this effect. There's a condition commonly known as cancer fog, and the technical name is cancer-related cognitive impairment, and it affects a variety of things to do with the frontal lobe. So executive functions, concentration, reading to yourself, navigating. You're losing your train of thought halfway through a conversation, searching for a word in your brain and you can't find it. It's very upsetting for people experiencing it. So I noticed people going through cancer treatment lost this ability to read, not all the time, but often enough for it to be seen as a pattern. So the reason we're reading aloud is because it uses a different part of your brain that is less affected by cancer and cancer treatments.
The theory behind reading aloud to people is that they have got brain fog, so they're not really as equipped to read to themselves.
Correct.
But also that the actual act of hearing someone else read to you is also therapeutic.
Absolutely. There's that warmth of human connection because we do it face-to-face unless somebody is remote or interstate, and then we do it over Zoom.
And that's more than you'd get from an audiobook, I imagine. Audiobooks therapeutic?
There's been no studies, so I can't really say yes or no. However, I'm a big advocate for audiobooks. I'm a big advocate for reading full stop, obviously. And if audiobooks are ticking the box for you, I've had a couple of participants from my study who I've suggested they move on to audiobooks when we finish our program, and I know some have.
That's really great advice. So you were talking about how you're passionate about having people read, be it someone reading to them, reading to themselves, or audiobooks. So what's your background? Where does your passion for this topic come from?
Okay, I've had a few different careers in my life. And
Which makes you a good researcher, I'm sure.
I hope so. I actually started as a computer programmer, believe it or not, and working for a big organisation, retrenchments come through, and I retrained to become a secondary school teacher, teaching IT, mostly maths, a few other things. But one of the things I was teaching, because it was a little school, was English. And I just said, at the time, yes, I can read, write and speak, I can teach English. But when I had these, they were year 7s at the time, oh no, we don't go to the library, we don't read. What do you mean you don't read? I didn't understand how you would not read. I championed the Premier's Reading Challenge in my school. And one girl said, my mum says I don't have to do this. And I said, but why wouldn't you want to do it? I just couldn't understand. So in my role teaching English, I got my students back into libraries. And when I saw my students, I'd started off reading again at year 7. At year 10, at lunchtime, I still remember vividly this group of girls arguing about which of the vampire, remember the Twilight series, which vampire's character they were going to marry. I thought, I've won. They're reading and they're enjoying it, yes. So from there, I progressed into an interest in working in libraries and getting literacy out there again and promoting reading. And so it just seemed a natural progression. And then working in libraries, when I noticed the pattern of people going through cancer treatment, often losing the ability to read, that's when I contacted the university here because I had done my master's here remotely, And I said, I've noticed this. What do you think? We love it. Apply. Let's do this.
So where's your studies taking you?
I'm getting a huge kick out of it. Every time I have one of my, particularly my metastatic cancer patients who are quite unwell, and they're laughing at something I'm reading. Oh, it feels so nice. It really does.
Yeah. And what results are you seeing? We've talked about emotional. Are there physical benefits of being read aloud too?
Now, that's a really interesting question, Michaela, because something unexpected has come out with a few people so far, and that's to do with quality of sleep, which wasn't something I was looking for. But I've had a few people now come back and tell me, I slept amazingly last night after the session. Or yesterday, actually, I was reading to a lady, and she said, I don't want to be rude, but I struggled to stay awake. And I thought, I'm boring. But for her, because she's quite anxious, naturally, she's going through a horrible experience with her cancer. She just got immersed in the stories and relaxed, and she went and had a big sleep. Her sleep was not interrupted for a change through anxiety.
And also, I suppose, if you're getting better rest, it could maybe be because your pain management has been enhanced and you're maybe not as aware of your pain.
Actually, Michaela, yes. The people who are experiencing chronic pain, I do ask them, because we do an exit interview at the end, and sometimes they volunteer it during the program as well, that it's taken their mind away from their pain.
Yeah. And what sort of books are they reading? Are there certain books that get a better result than others?
It's a 6-week program, so we're together for about 45 minutes once a week for 6 weeks, and I choose material based on what they've told me they like. It's usually short stories, because that way we can cover 1 or 2 in that period of time for each session, rather than trying to remember what happened last week in the novel. I had one gentleman extremely unwell, and can I mention actual titles?
Yeah, I'd love you to.
So Kitty Flanagan, for instance, this gentleman this particular day, he was not at all, in fact, he was in bed. I actually went in his room and read to him, and he laughed and laughed at Kitty Flanagan, and sadly that was my last visit with him, he passed away, and his wife was so appreciative.
I was thinking of some other comedies, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. They're light and funny.
True, but we need bite-sized. That's the only thing.
Yes. Okay, so it does. So that's where poetry and short stories are beneficial.
I get a big kick, as I said before, out of hearing my participants chuckle. And bookish humour is a very individual thing. Not everyone will chuckle at the same things. Some people will be quiet until the twist at the end and go, and then they laugh their head off, and others will laugh throughout. And I was thinking about some funny ones to mention today, and I thought about Sophie Kinsella, I've Got Your Number. And that's something I listen to as an audiobook, and it's hilarious because it's a series of text messages, but when it's read to you, it sounds like dialogue. Very funny dialogue. So humour's very individual, and I know I had a participant request some P.G. Wodehouse, and I had never read any before, and it's either silly or it's hilarious and really, really good. So
some of your research participants are broadening your reading perspective.
Correct, yes.
Isn't that nice?
Yes, and I'm broadening theirs too. For instance, reading a lot of Jeffrey Archer short stories. I didn't realise he was so good at that. Maeve Binchy is having a big resurgence in my program. Anna Jacobs as well. Monica McInerney is very popular in my program.
So I've read a few of her books, but she does shorter books as well.
Yes, and some very clever ones.
Can you think of any titles?
There's a really good one called Hippie Hippie Shake. That's the short story. It's in a collection called All Together Now. Very popular. Men and women. I read some of these stories too, and everybody laughs at it, which is really good. Yeah. And I will mention one of my favourite books. It's called The 13th Gift by Joanne Hoost Smith. Despite me praising fiction so much, it's a narrative non-fiction. It starts with a tragedy, which doesn't sound like I'm recommending it. However, the whole remainder of the book is uplifting, and it's healing, and it's eye-opening, and thinking we can all change the world in little ways. It's almost like a recipe book for making others feel better. What else? So I pre-read everything before I read it to my participants to check for appropriateness. Like there was a book of Aussie yarns, and there's this one I read, and it was called A Pauper's Funeral. And so normally I wouldn't touch a topic like that with my group, but this particular gentleman, his wife had told me that he went to see a stand-up comedian making fun of cancer treatments, and he laughed his head off. So I told him at the start, it's set around a funeral, but it's really funny. He said, yep, go for it. And he loved it. It's very funny. That's Bill Swampy Marsh wrote that.
So what do you hope can be achieved with your research?
I have a huge hope, Michaela, that we can show a positive result, so bibliotherapy helps in this context, and go to cancer centres and say, please let me help you set up a bibliotherapy program. Specifically a reading aloud program, only because I've seen people struggle to do it for themselves. I don't see any point just giving someone a list of books and saying, these will be good, off you go. But on that note, the UK, we mentioned the reading agency earlier. They do have lists of mood-enhancing books on their website.
Oh, who is this? What?
The Reading Agency.
The Reading Agency, okay.
They're a UK not-for-profit group. Amazing work they do over there. And they also have a couple of lists where cancer patients have nominated books that they found helpful at the time. They have another good series called Quick Reads. The Reading Agency have sponsored those. So it's some really good authors that you'll know, but they've written books that are about 100 pages long.
I also noticed in my short amount of searching on the internet, Bibliotherapy with the State Library of Victoria. Have you come across that resource?
I have, yes.
What are your feelings on it?
I think it's great.
Yeah.
They did a couple of series during COVID because Melbourne was so locked down, and the whole idea was to take you out of your head for a while into another place.
Some great resources there.
They are. And another that might also fit the bill for people who want to be read to is a new podcast I've just found called Women Read. In each episode, different everyday women choose a book they love and they read the first chapter aloud. There's all sorts of accents and approaches, and I absolutely rate the one where Stella, one of the volunteers, reads Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. She really should be a professional actor.
Oh, what a fun way to be introduced to books you might want to go on and read more of to yourself later.
Yeah, exactly.
You've been listening to Tsundoku, the podcast for addicted readers or readers who can't actually get to their bed for all the books that are beside it.
Hi, my name is Tony. I'm 67 years old and a lover of books. I started reading feverishly about 10 years ago, but before that I was a reader, but it wasn't 2 books a week type stuff. It was, what's my favourite book, and I would read it. The first one that I remember being my favourite for about a decade was Patrick Susskind's Perfume. After that, I read this other book called The Vintner's Luck by Elizabeth Knox. It was her first book. She was a New Zealand writer, and I love that. It trumped Perfume. I run a business that doesn't get a lot of customers, not because it's a shit business, but because of the nature of the business that it is. And so I've got a reading chair outside, and I read outside, and it puts me in touch with my community. People see what I'm reading. They want to know whether it's worth reading. I tend to be a one book at a time person. I don't understand people that can do 3 different books at different times. At the moment, I'm reading the Jane Harper book, but after that, I'm going back to an old favourite, a guy called Dr. Peter Goldsworthy, and he's from Adelaide. And, when he writes, you know exactly where you are. He describes streets in Prospect and, standing at different cafes in the city, and that's a nice feeling. It's nice to have localised type events like that. And he's actually a very, very good writer as well.
And don't forget, we love to hear about your reading habits. So if you'd like to tell us what's in your Tsundoku, what you've been reading, why you love reading it, or even just a little bit about yourself, how you got started reading, just record a voice memo. That's like an MP3 file, and send it in to us at sundokucast@gmail.com.
And that's it, Michaela, for our 13th episode.
Oh, they said we'd never make it. I'm Michaela Andreev.
And I'm Kath Keneally. Catch you next time.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts who are refusing treatment.
Annie Hastwell,
Kath Keneally,
Sarah Martin,
And me, Michaela Andreev. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. And if you want to know more about the books, the authors, or the music featured in this episode, check out the show notes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at SundokuCast. That's TSUNDOKU cast.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.